Yo, and welcome to the 178th episode of League of Rage Pokemon Trading Card Game Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Kevin Clemente, aka Mellow_Magikarp. I'm joined today by a very special temporary guest host. Joining me for, I want to say the third, maybe fourth time. You've been on quite a few times. We have the one and only Twitter troll himself, Jake Gearhart. Jake, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me. My voice is a little bit scratchy. I've been sick the past couple weeks or so, but I think I'm over it enough to where I can do a podcast.
This is actually perfect. Like a sick voice is like the ideal podcast voice. So if anything, this is the best you've ever sounded. So Jake, I've asked you here today because I said Twitter troll. I think you've actually gone away from that quite a bit. You've done a really good job of putting out some intense threads on future format stuff. I think you're one of the best communicators about future formats in the game right now. Like you're always thinking a step ahead while a lot of people are focused on the current format. And our topic today is the future format a couple weeks from now, right? People are thinking about, I'll say it's Birmingham or whatever, the E regional and then the NA regional right after that in San Antonio. But we have a card coming up, the baby Pokemon Budew. We have seen every take imaginable. I assume you've seen even more than me on Twitter, right? But we've seen people like, this thing should be banned in advance, all the way to this thing is terrible and unplayable and people are overrating it. So it's a 30 HP Pokemon, no retreat, 0 energy attack cost. I'm going to say irritating pollen. You can correct me if that's wrong if you've seen the official translation. Does 10 damage and your opponent can't play any item cards from their hand. So the question is, what does this card actually do? Where does it lie on that spectrum of format breaking and complete trash that people are overhyping like always?
Yeah, so I think Budew is really one of the most ambitious sort of format changing cards that I guess the game designers have printed in a while. Where it's not like Budew is going to have a massive impact on the format, but the potential of it, just reading the effect, item lock for 0 energy, is really I guess it's a very risky card for the game designers to print, especially considering in the past, one of the game designers with the World Championships in Japan, they did an interview and said that specifically Seismitoad EX was one of their worst mistakes ever. So to see a card that just item locks for no energy on a basic, it really gets you thinking about how much work they've probably put into this card and making sure it does what they want it to do to the game. And there's some interesting things about why Budew does exactly 10 damage, why it has the stat that it does, that sort of lead it a little bit into that. You can clearly tell that a little bit of there's hints of thought process in just the stats on the card, but overall, why did they decide to print this card? And I think the reason is sort of the same reason why they printed a card like Jirachi I guess a year and a little bit ago.
Yeah. It's been like a year and a half, actually. Jirachi's been around a while.
Yeah, it has. Paradox Rift, I don't remember when that came out. But I think when people are always talking about what Budew is, Budew is such a toxic card, it's going to be exactly like Banette EX, but it's on a basic, so it's so much worse. Or Seismitoad EX flashbacks, just because you're getting item locked on the same turn, your opponent goes second, item locks you turn 1. But I think Budew is more comparable to a card like Jirachi or Manaphy or any of these small tech Pokemon that you play to fix specific matchups. And Budew has a less clear effect, a less targeted one, where Manaphy and Jirachi were, especially Jirachi's, literally just to stop Sableye. I guess and got in the way of Cresselia sometimes, but you could tell Jirachi was worded just to stop Sableye. They don't want it to stop stuff like Dragapult because it's only targeting basics. But Budew is a little bit much wider of an impact. And I think the main thing, much wider of the impact because it's just a blanket item lock. Like Jirachi can only stop the damage counters from basics. But Jirachi was to stop a specific archetype, whereas Budew is to stop a certain play style or move away from it to allow the game designers to sort of open things up in different directions in different places. So I think the main thing that Budew is going to allow the game designers to do, like overall, is have a better balance between basic Pokemon, Stage 1 Pokemon, and Stage 2 Pokemon. And you can see that they put a lot of thought into this into TCG Pocket, where the balance between like basic Stage 1, Stage 2 attackers is done fairly well. Like the amount of commitment that you have to play into to get Stage 2s into play, especially things like the Charizard EX where you're powering it up with the Moltres, and you kind of just win the game when you get that in play. But it's like balanced so that it's fine that that's possible because your opponent has options to pressure you out of the game before that. So I think Budew will kind of allow them to make Stage 2s substantially better in the metagame than they are right now. And people sort of immediately, the initial reaction was this is going to kill Stage 2 decks because it stops rare candy. But as we see in Japan, it's done more good for them than harm. Because things like in the near future, Regidrago, sort of the like turn 2 Phantom Dive attack, or Kyurem is just so devastating for Stage 2 decks, and Budew is completely shutting down that for the most part without the ability to play Energy Switch or Prime Catcher, like any of those like insanely powerful item cards in Regidrago. It really stops that deck specifically. But Budew in general is going to make it so that any deck that like doesn't want to be attacked by a Stage 2 first is probably going to have an option, unless you're playing your own Stage 2 deck. So if you're either playing like a basic focus deck like Miraidon or Saraledge, a Stage 1 focus deck, you can play Budew and use it to guarantee that your opponent's not going to attack you before you attack them. And I think that's a very important thing for the game to have, because it gives the game designers those options and sort of allows them to make Stage 2s as the playing from a prize deficit. And I think that comes into where like how we've seen like a sort of increase in power level of Stage 2s over the past few sets, with Dragapult and Dusknoir, and even Togekiss coming in the Golden Go decks. But these Stage 2s that are able to force multi-KO turns, where Dragapult can snipe things down and Dusknoir just knocks anything out with 130 HP or less. And the problems, like the decks where Dusknoir has become like a gatekeeper, are really the hyper aggressive ones like Palkia Dusknoir, where Dusknoir is being used as the aggressor, and there's really no counter to that. Like you just have to take it, hope your board, like fill up your board with 4 Dreepies or something, and hope they don't all get board wiped. Whereas Budew is going to sort of be an answer to that, where it's much harder to use Dusknoir as an aggressive card, and you're rather going to be using it to sort of manipulate the mid game and late game. And Budew is like sort of going to allow Dusknoir. It takes away the bad stuff with Dusknoir, in my opinion. The Palkia Dusknoir like strategies, where they're just trying to board wipe you, become much harder when you get item locked. But what doesn't really become harder is just like finding a Stage 1 and putting it into play, or using TM Evolution when we have Arven in the format. So I think obviously Stage 2 decks are going to have to rely a little bit more on TM Evolution than Rare Candy, at least for the early turns, just as far as search goes, or even in the first set of rotation, the Brox, whatever it's called, where you can search for just an evolution Pokemon or 2 basics. I think supporters like these, and even in this format, we see Lance is what Dragapult's playing. A lot of these Dragapult lists, like 2 or 3 Lance plus 1 or 2 Luminion, just because like that turn 2 search while you're getting item locked is important to have. But stuff like Dragapult isn't being overly like it's not being gate kept by things like Regidrago, and it's also not gatekeeping other decks. We see plenty of variety in this next format, with like decks like Archaludon and Lugia and Miraidon, Saraledge, like the more in Golden Go, like the more aggressive archetypes aren't getting gate kept by Dragapult.
So Jake, I want to go back to something you said actually in the beginning. but I think it kind of ties into what you were just talking at the end. So you mentioned the game designers had Seismitoad as their biggest mistake, or one of their biggest mistakes, right? And Seismitoad, of course, for the players who don't remember, EX, capital E, capital X, 180 HP, double color, or 2 colorless energy, and there was, double colorless at the time, which did not have double turbos, -20, and did 30 damage plus item locked with Quaking Punch. We have not seen another basic that item locks since then, correct? So obviously with the Benetti X, there was a Luxio at some point, whatever the stage 1 is between Luxray and the little guy. But I don't remember seeing another basic that item locked since that Seismitoad, correct?
We did have Vikavolt V. That was around.
Thank you. Yes, and that was a real deck there for a little while, mostly because of Lugia. I feasted on Lugia.
It was a real deck when it first released as well, because we had Electro Power in the format.
That's
probably
right.
Designed to be there for quite a while longer, because in Japan they we only started doing the like by letter rotations like the last couple of years, but Japan has had it since the start of Sun and Moon. So like Vikavolt with Electro Power was there for I think like 2 or 3 months, maybe even more than that. But that deck was like, pretty solid Pika Rom. But that was a terrible format.
Oh no, that was a good Pika Rom deck. Electro Power with the Vikavolt. No. Anyway, so outside of the Vikavolt, we haven't seen item lock on a basic since then. And you mentioned that indicates that clearly they did a lot of testing and all that stuff. And then you mentioned that it does 10 damage and that's relevant and all this. What exactly gives you the confidence that this card is incredibly balanced? Attacking for no energy seems really broken. We'll just use the usual word, right? 10 damage advances your win condition. A deck like Dragapult just likes damage counters on the board. So what gives you that confidence that it was well tested?
Yeah, so I think the first point is that it's coming out in literally the last set before rotation. And I think that the game designers are probably going to end up doing more of this. There's hints of it with other cards, but Budew will rotate as like the first thing. It'll only be in the format for 2 years rather than 3, like cards at the start of the Scarlet Violet, or like start of Brilliant Stars is the one that's rotating out now, where Arceus V-Star was in the format for 3 years. Badoo is only going to be in the format for 2. So they want to limit it. It's one of the very few cards that is in just this, just the last set, the few new cards that's in the last set. So placing it there is an indication that they know they don't want it forever. They just want it for a limited amount of time. So they put thought into that. The fact that it does 10 damage really matters a lot, because it prevents things like trapping permanently. So you could imagine there's a lot of decks where if you could just get something like a Bibarel trapped active, you just lose the game instantly if it's getting item locked every turn, especially because you can't play things like Super Rod to recover energies. And so doing the little bit of damage is actually worse for the card, in terms of power level, than if it did 0 damage. I think it would be much more powerful if it did 0 damage. But there's some interesting things you can do with it with the 10 damage, especially with the Cloth deck while that's still in rotation with the double turbo, where you can play the Mochis and Brute Bonnet to sort of get it to do a good chunk of damage. And I guess after rotation we have that Volcanion EX, I think, where it burns your opponent's active. So you can do some combos with Budew there where you're actually doing damage. But I think the damage holds it back from being overpowered in sort of these trapping scenarios. And I think just the fact that this is a card that is coming out specifically after things they singled out Seismitoad X as being a problem. That game designers tend to not make the same exact mistake twice. They make some pretty close mistakes twice, but getting item lock that wrong 2 times would be pretty unrealistic, I think. Especially considering the last couple times with Vikavolt and Banette, it's been pretty balanced.
I want to go back real quick to the trapping part, because I think this is another thing I haven't heard people mention, and I think it's because people who didn't play an item lock they may have thought about it and just not said it, but people who did play an item lock take a lot of stuff for granted of their experience. that idea of using multiple Budews, like turns in a row, right? Or just recycling it or whatever. Like you would trap the B barrel and you're like, okay, whatever. I'm always going to keep 2 energies. It's like, okay, I have another Budew and another gust. Now you need to keep 4 energies without super rod and stuff like that. And it adds up, right? Or like gravity gemstone on a pheasantipity. And then you bring up another one, like that recursion becomes a big issue. It's not just like, whatever, I can play around trapping my B barrel. I can play around trapping my, whatever. It's like, well, can you do it again and again and again, right? Does it suddenly become a win condition? And that's, again, something I haven't heard people talk about a lot of. They're like, oh, you can Budew turn 1. It's like, well, you can also Budew turn 6 and then 7 and then 8 when your opponent suddenly overextended their hand, right? So that's kind of what you're talking about there. And I wanted to clarify that one, just in case any listeners weren't, up to date on the item lock meta.
Yeah, it's definitely a very good point. We saw with sort of some of the most old item lock strategies with not the oldest, but like Gothitelle Excelgor. That was a deck a long time ago where stage 2 Gothitelle has the same ability as the Tyranitar in the next set, where if it's active, your opponent can't play any item cards. And then you'd use this Excelgor, which is similar to there's a Dudunsparce in the current format, where you paralyze your opponent's active Pokemon and then shuffle it into the deck so you can re-promote the Gothitelle, or in this case, I guess we could have Dudunsparce Tyranitar as a sort of a throwback in a set from now.
Oh gosh.
But that deck was sort of all about sort of preventing your opponent from ever playing a switching card, preventing them from ever getting out of the item lock because they were paralyzed and item locked. So you'd use there's another Dusknoir which like allows you to move damage counters around. So you just knock out your opponent's bench Pokemon continuously, so they could never play the game once you get the setup. And I think Budew doing damage, and also things like Radiant Alakazam rotating, and double turbo rotating, so you can't make Budew do 0 damage. Like these like full trapping strategies are harder than they would have been otherwise if it did 0 damage. But I like it still does take a while to KO things, which I think does make the game. I think it actually adds to the game, that the fact that like it adds strategy, whereas these trapping things, like normally you just go infinite and you can just wait till your opponent decks out. If you play like one draw supporter, like one shuffle draw supporter or a Squovit or something to prevent deck out, you just wait for your opponent to deck out. Here you actually have to like think about the turns, and sort of plan. Like if you want to go for a trapping strategy, they are available if your opponent overextends their resources, doesn't keep stuff like Iono around to reshuffle their hand. So you can trap things for a good amount of turns, but not infinitely. And I think that actually adds, like, on top of making strategies less like degenerate, I guess, less like they're more fun to play against when you're not just getting trapped forever, but more interesting for both players, because you could run into these situations where you're like, oh, I really want to research here, but if I have 10 cards left in deck, my opponent can trap my Pheasantipity for 4 turns, and then I can't play another research after that, and that would make me lose the game. Like some of these very interesting, intricate end games could happen with Budew, which I like. Yeah.
You also mentioned in there, and you explained it a little bit, but I kind of want to go back to it, and that is a lot of people have mentioned the Budew's going to kill stage 2 decks, right? Because you can't rare candy, and you're like, well, you can play more, like you said, Dragapult playing Lance and playing like a 4/4 line instead of the 4/2 that they currently play, or whatever they currently play, right? Like Charizard can have the TM Evos and the Pidgeotto and all that other stuff. But then, well, what if the decks like Drago and stuff like that just play their own Budew to stall out while you're stalling them, while they're slowly evolving and all that? Are Budew wars going to become a thing as the meta evolves, or is this like a headcanon thing that people are like kind of worried about, of like, well, then the fast decks will just Budew you so that they can set up behind, you know what I mean, right? Like, is the war going to become a thing, or is this just like scare tactics?
I think it will become a thing, but I think it favors the evolution decks rather than the non-evolution decks. I mean, first of all, like it's hard to find Budew if you're not playing Buddy Buddy Puff, and like you want to use your nest balls on your attackers. And whilst like stage 2 decks have the option to play Buddy Buddy Puff and get out their like attacker line plus Budew, And also generally the basic Pokemon have lower retreat costs, so you don't have to find an extra thing like Latios to move your attacker. Would it move whatever you started with? So you could just retreat into Budew. But I think yeah, Budew Wars will happen. But the if you think about something like a matchup where like Regidrago versus Gardevoir, like Regidrago, as soon as Gardevoir like gets a Gardevoir EX into play, like that's really bad for Regidrago. You don't want to be in a spot unless you have your V Star saved. Then it's kind of fine. But if you have to use your V Star and they get a Gardevoir EX in play, you're a little bit screwed. You can just lose so easily to like Unfair Stamp, and then Gardevoir EX hits 190 into your Pheasantipity, then like Monkey Dories it and KOs your Drago, and then you're lost. So I think like these situations like favor the Gardevoir player. So if Regidrago is item locking, Gardevoir is item locking, all Gardevoir needs is like just put down the Kirlia and then put down a Gardevoir, and then like even if Gardevoir doesn't do anything else for the next 5 turns while Regidrago sets up their Cologne combo, like it doesn't matter. You still got your Gardevoir EX into play. So I think yeah, in the short term, Budew does favor these evolution decks over time. But I do think it is a really good point that decks like Miraidon or even Raging Bolt can use Budew. And I think that actually like makes the format better as well, because with a lot of these like especially Miraidon, or I guess yeah, Raging Bolt as well. But if you miss the turn 1 attack, or like in Miraidon's case, if you miss the turn 1 hands, you're probably losing the game to Gardevoir or Dragapult or whatever. When they can play rare candies, or especially Charizard, when they can play rare candy. But if they can't play rare candy, you can just Budew them, and they won't be able to like pressure you with that stage 2 attack before you've attacked them. So it sort of increases the probability that the basic attacking deck is going to get the first attack. And I think that's overall a better thing for the game. That like in and of itself makes stage 2 decks a little bit weaker. But it's like easy for the game designers to compensate for that. They can print better stage 2s or better search for them. Whereas like if you just leave the attacks inconsistent, then the only times like if Miraidon is going to be good in the format, it has to be so good that like when you get the first attack off, you just win the game. Or if you don't, you lose the game. And that's just not as much fun as like, I'm definitely going to get the first attack off. And as a stage 2 deck, I should expect my opponent to get the first attack off. Where do we go from here? And I think that, yeah, it's more consistent. And I think consistent early games are better overall. But Budew does cause a couple problems with early game consistency, which I think is like one of the downsides of the card. It's obviously not a perfect solution. Like the game designers need many years to make like a substantial change with the balance between basics and evolutions in the game. And you can see with Pocket how different the gameplay is. So
that actually kind of led into another question I had, and I've heard this take before too. People have said Budew will lead to more non-games than we currently have, in that, you go first, you're like, well, I didn't start my Buddy Poffin, so, I pass and my opponent Budews me, and now suddenly I can't Arven for Buddy Poffin, even though I had it, blah, 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 right? Do you think that Budew is going to lead to more non-games than our current standard format has?
Yeah, I think if it does, it's not going to be noticeable, like a noticeable amount of non-games. I think it will happen because with the way decks are built currently, you're kind of like, especially evolution decks, they need to play Buddy Poffin. And if you like start none in hand, and then your opponent Budews you, and then you have an Arven but nothing else in hand, then you're kind of ruined from there because you can't play your Poffins. I think this will like change, especially with we see like Dragapult playing more Lance, and I think once that Brock supporter comes out, that's going to help a lot with that. Because you can play that when you're item locked. But I don't think it's like as much as people think. And currently we see things like the amount of non-games that Gardevoir plays against Regidrago, like slow Gardevoir. I mean, I guess the rare candy Gardevoir plays more of those games because you can just candy Guardy and try to blow something up on turn 2. But the slow Gardevoir or even Dragapult with Regidrago dominating, like if those decks don't go first, they just lose the game because you get turn 2 phantom dived, or like maybe with a Howlucha in there too. If once those before when those decks were popular, like Dragos were playing the Howlucha to do that, especially against Charizard, you could like do the PGKOing Charmander or whatever. And also Kyurem, obviously, like if you don't find Manaphy, you lose the game instantly because they pulled off the Kyurem attack. It's not quite that extreme because yeah, obviously there are ways to combat getting board wiped. But I think those games are even though they're not non-games, well, yeah, even though they're not non-games, they're not very interesting gameplay wise. Like it's one player getting a dominating advantage, and then maybe you stick an Iono and your opponent completely loses the game from there, which I think is just not very interesting gameplay. And I think overall Budew will create more interesting gameplay because it'll sort of lock in these differences between basic stage 1 and stage 2 attackers.
That makes sense. So I want to go back to the Japanese results. So we saw at the Champions League Osaka that Budew was not quite as dominant as everyone kind of said. Like, this thing's going to be amazing, right? People were tweeting out it's in 60% of all City League top cut decks, or whatever number was actually there, right? And then we saw the finals had 0 Budews, Ancient Box versus Archaludon. We saw a few Dragapults here and there in the top 16. There was a Charizard in there as well, and some other just like shenanigans, but it was not the dominant force. Azul on stream had a Budew counter, and I don't actually know what it got up to, but in the day 2 where I left off, it was at like 14 between, 9 rounds of what he watched day 1 into the couple rounds of day 2. Why didn't it show at Japan as much as everyone said that it was going to?
Yeah, so I think this kind of comes down to the difference in the way I think that people should evaluate Budew compared to how they are. Like people think about Budew as these like similar to item block cards in the past, and I think this is like sort of a natural thing that when you're learning any like competitive card game, you'll do this where you sort of just categorize effects based on what you think they've been like in the past, and if you don't like look deeply at a card or a new effect. And you just categorize it very easily or very quickly. Like you can run into these pitfalls where Budew is not like a Banette card or a Seismitoad or Vikavolt, where it's a deck. It's a tech card for certain matchups, and it's weak in some matchups. It's good in others. It's weak in some decks. It's good in others. And I think what we saw at the Japan Championships, and also in some of the more recent city leagues, is the decks that lose heavily to Budew just did very poorly at the tournament. So obviously the top decks, like they either made the call not to play Budew or they played a deck which doesn't need Budew because these decks that are weak to Budew got kicked out of the format, like Regidrago. So you see things like Archaludon and Ancient Box and Saraledge, which are pretty Budew resilient decks. Like they don't really care that much about getting item locked. They can, especially in Archaludon's case, you could literally just do 30 for 1 energy and take the free prize card. So I think if you look at the full tournament and we see where Budew lined up, and where these Budew weak decks lined up, I think you'll see like a lot more of the Regidragos and things in like the lower end of day 2 if we could see it, like all clustered there because they got pushed out by Budews in the first day, and now the decks that don't lose to Budew or don't need Budew are succeeding. And so I think it'll sort of go in waves. Like obviously right now nobody's playing Jirachi in their decks. I guess in some online tournaments, Lost Box has been popping up more, and people have added it back in. But Budew will work like a Jirachi card, where you play it when you want to fix some of your matchups, rather than like a core strategic element to your deck. Like Gardevoir or Dragapult, they can use TM Evo, and they're perfectly happy doing that against most decks. It's like more consistent for them to do that than to Budew. But Budew is better against certain other decks, like Regidrago, where if you choose to TM Evo instead of Budew, you're going to get board wiped. And so yeah, while these threats, and also there's no like Terapagos Dusknoir is another big one, where Budew hurts that deck a lot against the stage 2s. because Terrapagos got a lot of its advantage from board wiping early game, or just getting an extra turn, even if you're not fully board wiping them, stopping the setup enough to where you get an extra attack. Budew will kind of prevent those situations. So the stage twos and the non Budew caring about decks are just happen to be the ones that are succeeding right now. And I think if you look at the Japan Championships metagame, and if that turns out to be sort of the metagame in like online tournaments leading up into our regionals, then something like Regidrago might be a very good call for the first event where Budew is legal, because people might not be playing it as much because these weaker decks, or these non-Budew decks are succeeding. So yeah, it'll work in waves where you'll see Budew, a lot of Budew, and then the things that lose to Budew go away, and then you cut the Budew, and then they come back, and you put Budew back in, and that kind of thing.
So we're going to see the sine wave Decigoons curve. Are you expecting that? Yep. For those who don't know, it's the up and down curve, right? And then it's like, oh, there's a lot of Decidui, which was a wall deck, a Mimikyu, right thing. And then, oh, everyone's going to tech against it. And so it goes away. And so the line goes down, and then it goes back up because everyone took their techs out because there's no more Decidui and etc., right? Is there anything else you want to say about Budew for the current format before we jump even further into the future? Because of course you've been cooking.
Yeah, I think I've covered pretty much everything for the current format. Yeah, I in general, my personal feelings towards it are that I'm much more excited for the gameplay of this format than the Regidrago format gameplay. I think the Regidrago Regidrago mirrors are pretty interesting, but most of Regidrago's other matchups are I don't find them very fun because they're very like back and forth. What I don't like in gameplay I've realized recently is like large swings in win percentage for each turn. I like it more when it's kind of like over the course of the game you're building like plus 5% to your advantage each turn, and then like the better player like slowly gains their advantage over the course of the game, and in the end you play an Iono, and that kind of spins the wheel, and whoever had the higher balance is winning most of the time. Whereas like Regidrago promotes gameplay where it's like okay, going into this turn I have like an 80-20 matchup, but I missed my prime catcher Cologne turn. Now I have a 20% chance to win the game. I need my opponent to miss back-to-back attacks. And then the opponent misses or like Pokestop something bad, and then you're just back up immediately to winning the game. Where it can be exciting for some people, but personally I don't like that. And I think Budew kind of eliminates those scenarios a little bit.
I love that you said you do enjoy the Regidrago mirror, because I keep saying that to people and everyone's like, what are you talking about? I think it's one of the most interesting mirrors we've had in a while.
Yeah, it's like it feels very XY, early XY, late black and white era, which I guess is kind of nostalgic to me. That's when I started playing. But where it's everything's a two prizer. You do have the Radiant Charizard though, which is like a really crucial piece in the matchup. But what I like about it is when both players have like you have to use their V-Star power like turn one, and then you're just fighting like a resource battle for the full rest of the game. You have like very limited energies. You have to you played a bunch of researches early. You have like no you have like one recovery card. You have to like think about, okay, I'm gonna get my Radiant Charizard back. I need this switch card, which is again, if I don't time this switch correctly, my opponent can just trap me and I lose the game. Like these types of scenarios are what I like, and that happens like a decent amount of time in the Drago mirror. The games where it goes like perfectly for both players are terrible, but usually it doesn't happen. So I think that mirror is fine.
So you have been thinking about the post-rotation and journey together format, where we will be dominated by Enza Zoroark 60-card mirrors from Tord's Masterclass. I assume, at least. That's what I'm expecting Atlanta to be. How are you expecting Budew, and I guess the general post-rotation meta, if you've been putting that much thought or even testing into it, how do you expect this to change from the current standard format?
Yeah, well, first I'll say on the Tord point, I think at least for how I view Zoroark and the decks that Tord likes to play, I think he'll actually be a little bit disappointed about Zoroark. It feels more like these like a Mew VMAX kind of a super aggressive deck rather than it's very hard to just tank and heal and play long games with Zoroark. You're pressured to use like the Darmanitan early and things like that. Um, but yeah, I think the as far as like Budew is concerned, the impact it'll have is especially because we're losing a card like Manaphy, where bench protection. So since the start of the Scarlet and Violet era, you could sort of tell that this was the direction that the game designers were going because I think in Crown Zenith, the last Sword and Shield set, we saw like there were a bunch of snipe attacks on random basics that are just not good right now because we have Manaphy, but they would be like actually pretty broken if we didn't. Like the Kyogre that just does 180 snipe on the bench. Yeah, I can't remember the other ones, but they really toned down the power level of the snipe attacks for Scarlet Violet era. And most of these cards have been like Greninja EX. That's like a pretty powerful attack, but there's even things like Pawmot EX, which does like 220 snipe, or Garchomp EX 120 snipe for 2 energies. Like these attacks get a lot better, but they're all on stage 2 Pokemon now. So Badew's biggest impact is it's going to act like Manaphy on the early turns of the game because we have no easy way to snipe on like low HP or on low stage Pokemon. Like Darmanitan is like one of the big ones. I think that's like one of the best, if not the best card coming out of next set.
And for those who don't know,
yeah.
Oh, are you gonna say it? Ends Darmanitan for well, it actually doesn't matter. You're gonna copy with Zoroark probably or use reversal energy. It does 90 to the active and then 90 to a benched Pokemon. And discard all energy from it.
Yeah. So I think especially with the combination with reversal energy makes it like super strong. But also I was looking at earlier, there's an Armor Rouge, which does like 180 snipe to the bench. I think it was in the like Surging Sparks or something. So like Armor Rouge just does 180 snipe for 3 energies. You can just reversal energy snipe anywhere on the bench, which is like a really interesting option for Ceruledge decks to have. Because it evolves from like the same Pokemon, so you could just play 4 reversal in one of those. And
you like to play the energy anyway, right? So you're like, well, whatever. I'll play dead energies.
You need the energies. Yeah. So I think those attackers all require reversal energies. So the sniping attackers that don't require reversal energies are like a very high amount of energy acceleration are all stage 2 Pokemon. So Budew will kind of act as like a way to slow those down to prevent them from getting sort of a board wiping advantage, where they're not going to be Candy, Greninja, Candy, Dusknoir, Sparkling Crystal, whatever, knock out everything. Because you're going to get item locked if you try to do that. And I think that's like the main thing that Budew is going to allow to be in the format without being oppressive, because you'll have this check for early game, and then you'll presumably get an advantage against them, and then they'll be able to come back with these double KO attacks. And yeah, I think that's the main point with Budew. One of the interesting things, though, I did notice about Budew is since we're losing Bibarel, Reverum gets like a lot better, but Reverum actually resists grass. So you can get your Reverum infinitely trapped by Budew, which I think is pretty interesting. Maybe like a pretty bad thing for Reverum fans if you were thinking about putting those in your decks. But
it's never going to see play now.
Yeah. Something to think about if you're playing a Reverum deck, you don't want to get infinitely Budew trapped. But I guess Reverum decks will probably play a bunch of energies because you need to discard, so they probably won't have too much trouble retreating them. Because the ability needs to discard energies, but anything that requires like superior energy retrievals plus Reverum is like, that's pretty dangerous. You're also Golden Go also resists Budew, but Golden Go, which does actually come up in like the Golden Go matchup sometimes, because you can like bring up like if they put like 4 in play and then mismanage their superiors or something, you can like Budew one, they attach a metal, you bring up the other, Budew the other, and then infinitely trap the Golden Go for the rest of the game.
If they don't have the Lamas, it becomes rough, right? Because you discard, 7 to take KO a Dragapult, you have the 8th on the other one. You're like, okay, I'm going to counter catcher a different one. I'm going to do 0. Now you suddenly need 2 energies to KO my Budew. And then it's like, well, now you're down 10 energies. And it adds up very quickly. Yeah. And if like, oh, I'm never going to KO you and you drew through your decks, you're going to deck out first.
Yep. So yeah, I think Budew and especially the Brock supporter is going to be a very interesting thing with the interaction with Budew. Like we really haven't seen a card like Brock be good for a long time. I guess Lance is kind of the comeback of that. Since the rule change where you couldn't play supporters on turn one, these like search supporters are just bad, which I think is a shame because I think the once per turn effective supporters is one of the most interesting things about Pokemon as a game in general, where the cost is not that. The cost is like you don't have to pay a cost to play the card, but the cost is that you can't play any other supporters for the rest of the game. So you have to make these decisions about timing and resources. Where like you want to play Research and Brock in the same turn, but you can't do that obviously. So I think Budew will help cards like that succeed by putting a little more pressure on item cards, like not to be too reliant on the setup item cards and be a bit more content going second. And it helps that balance as well, going first versus second advantage, because if you're playing sort of a more mix of supporters and items to set up your board, it'll favor the second player a little bit more because they get access to everything. By going second.
Well, Jake, thank you so much for bringing all of your knowledge here. Do you have any shout outs? And of course, where can people find you on social media for some of the best threads on Twitter as well?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Jake K. Gearhart. And shout out to Dead Draw Gaming. I'm going to be filming some more tabletop videos for them very soon. As soon as the full set reveal happens on this upcoming Thursday from when we're recording this.
Nice. Myself, you can find me on Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube, and Blue Sky at mellow_magikarp. Rate and review the show. Follow the podcast at Lake of Rage Pod. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. This has been another episode of the Lake of Rage podcast. We'll catch you all next week.